Thunderhead by Mary O'Hara. Chapter 12. Once the yearlings were out on the grass, there was no regular inspection of them during the summer. If anyone chanced to be riding on the saddleback, a report would be brought home as to their condition and growth, any changes of colouring or appearance, whether the band was split or whether it had disappeared altogether, which would mean that they were feasting in one of the little ravines of the mountainside, and that the next day would see them out in the open again. But it happened that the very day after Goblin's departure, the boys came home from school. The first thing they did was to fling themselves on horseback and ride out to see the yearlings, the Goblin in particular, and after a thorough afternoon's search returned and reported him missing. Everyone hunted for him. Rob drove the car to the neighbouring ranches and made inquiries. He posted a notice at the post office. The ranch itself was combed from end to end, for it was possible that the Goblin, with a precocious and unseemly interest in the mares, might have joined one of the older bands. But at the end of a week, Rob gave up, and the work of the ranch went on as usual. He said shortly that the colt would turn up again. He had run away. He would come back. Horses always did. Once oriented, they returned to the place of their birth. Ken was stupefied with grief. All winter long he had been thinking of the Goblin, of being with him, of beginning his training. With the money he had been able to save from his allowance, he had bought a stopwatch before he left Laramie. His fingers found it almost unconsciously, smooth and round and cool there in the little pocket of his pants beneath his belt. To touch it even had been exciting, as full of promise as a dinner bell. Now it was like a dead thing, cold and heavy. When he went to bed at night, he invented fantasies of what might have happened to the colt. The earth might have given way beneath his feet as he leaped a ravine, and then a fall, a broken leg, lying there dying, dead by now, and the coyotes and crawling things eating him. A clump of shrubs could have hidden the corpse so easily. And how many thousands of such shrubs there were on the ranch. That happened to Dixie a year ago. They had found the skeleton 6 months later. Another thing that had happened, a band of horses were grazing near the highway. A car passed, filled with noisy, ugly-looking men. Going up the hill by the overpass, one of them had shouted, "See that old mare? Bet I can hit her." He had taken his gun, stood up in the car, and pulled the trigger. The section gang working on the railroad that ran alongside the highway saw the whole thing. They saw the man shoot, saw the mare leap spasmodically, then go down with a crash, heard the burst of raucous laughter from the men, saw the car speed up and vanish over the hill. Ken began to shake in bed. A white colt in a band of dark horses, how easy to mark and single out. However, there would have been the body. They hadn't found anybody. There was some comfort in that. Goblin, meanwhile, was feeding in lush green pastures south of the border. Though in a single afternoon's play on the saddleback, he or any of the yearlings could run 20 miles and not know it. He had taken a full week to work his way to the foot of the Buckhorn Range. There was so much to see on the way, so many dells and ravines to explore, so many hillocks to stand open, gazing and studying and sniffing. So wide a country, so many bands of antelope and elk. The grass in every meadow tasted different. There were also those many hours when he stood facing north, the ranch, and his body would become taut, and that tingling and quivering would go all through him. Horses often appear to move as if propelled by their unconscious, rather than their conscious minds. Call them, and they will pay no attention, but will go on grazing as if they had not heard. Walk in the direction of the stable and finally disappear out of their sight. They will continue to graze, but slowly they will be working towards the stable. At length, as if entirely by accident, they will be there at the corral gate, saying, "Well, here we are." It was in this fashion that the Goblin moved. After his first start southward, he had just drifted. Now, here he was. It was the river that interested him. He had smelled it for miles before he reached it. He had never seen anything like it. It took him a long time to decide that there was nothing dangerous about it, though it moved. It plunged and leaped. It hurled itself over rocks. It tossed chunks of itself into the air. It was alive, therefore. It had a voice, too, a loud voice that never ceased its burble of sound. Incessantly it talked, whispered, gurgled, chuckled. Having power in himself, he knew that there was power in the river. Facing it, standing there on the brink, he felt that it challenged him, and he gathered himself to fight back. In an hour he had accepted the fact that the river would not attack him. It ignored him. Nothing he did altered its course or its behavior. He drank from it, at last, and the river did not even mind that. He followed it upward. It was leading him further into those hills which got steeper as they got closer until they sheered up, leaning over him, and the river was narrower, between higher walls. Its voice was a deep roar now. Occasionally, looking ahead, he would see it coming down over a wall of rock, blue on the slide, a smother of white below. The going was more difficult, and the feed more scarce. He had to leave the river to find pockets of grass and clover, but how lush and rich they were. All this time he had satisfied feeling that he was going where he wanted to go. But in the mornings he would find a high point and climb it and look north towards the ranch. Sometimes he would give an eager whinny, but when he got going again, it was on up the gorge. It must surely have been from the observation of horses that the proverb was drawn, the farthest fields always look the greenest. The path on the opposite side of the river always looked better to Goblin. He crossed many times, a leap from one rock to another, from there a scuffling plunge and a few swimming strokes that would get him across. Presently it would look better on the side he had left, and he must go back. So it happened that he was standing on a flat rock, just gathering himself to leap to another rock in midstream, when the thing was flung against his legs, so terrifying him that he made his leap badly, and was swept into the channel, and from then on knew nothing but the struggle to keep his nose above the water and claw himself out. When he accomplished this, he was some yards downstream. Even while he was shaking himself, his head turned to look back. What was it that had hit him? He must know. It was still there on the rock on which he had been standing, and it didn't move. With his ears alert and his eyes fastened on it, Goblin went back and investigated. A foal, not so unlike himself, except that instead of being all white, it had brown markings on it. It was, in fact, like Calico, his piebald granny. Goblin was shuddering all over. The foal had no eyes. They had been picked out. In half a dozen places there were bloody gashes. It was at this moment that he leaped to meet the flapping black cloud that dropped down upon him from the sky. Huge pinions beat about his head. The creature was as big as he was himself. Goblin emitted the first real scream of his life when, for a moment, the terrible face looking closely into his own and the great hooked beak drove for his eyes. Goblin reared and went over backward, the eagle flailing him with wings, beak and talons, rolling on the narrow rocky beach, half in and half out of water. Goblin struggled to get from under the creature. When he gained his feet, with the instinct of the fighting stallion, he darted his head down to bite the foreleg of his enemy. He got it between his teeth and crunched. He was clawed by the other leg. His shoulder was raked and gouged. The beating wings buffeted his head like clubs. He held on. The beak struck him again and again. Blood spurted from his neck and belly. Suddenly it was gone, shooting straight upward, then sliding into the shelter of the pines. Goblin stood alone, the thin shank partly covered with fine, closely set feathers, and the curled, cold, fist-like claw dangling from his teeth. There was a thin, bad-smelling blood oozing from the dead end of it. He dropped it and stood shuddering. It terrified him. Then, with his insatiable curiosity, he must stoop to smell it again. Never would he forget that smell. It sent him up on his hind legs, snorting. His ears were filled with the sound the eagle was making, a furious scream. Cark! 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 He leaped away from that fatal spot and went scrambling over the rocks downstream, working away from the riverbank towards easier going. The eagle peered from his pine tree. He sat on a bare bough, balancing himself on one claw and one stump and his spread wings. At his repeated cry of rage, the woods around him became alive with small, frightened, scurrying animals. His eyes, terrible in their far vision and their predatory determination, were fastened on the colt galloping northward, a white streak down the dark brink of the canyon, and at last a moving dot on the plains 5 miles away. The goblin used the speed that he had never used before. That had reached him, coiled like invisible, microscopic snakes in the chromosomes passed down to him by his forebears. It was a great run. Next morning, when the sun rose, the goblin stood comfortably among the yearlings of the Goose Bar Ranch, turned broadside to the delicious penetrating rays, snoring softly in peace and blissful ease. That's the end of chapter 12. Good night.